chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. We need to move a little quickly. I have titled this Epilogue, Yahweh, David, and the Ideal King of Israel. These 4 chapters record a number of different incidents or accounts from David's reign, which have no chronological or sequential connection. In other words, they're kind of loosely connected, collected with no real connection, except that they deal in some way with the reign of King David. As one writer puts it, and I quote, "On the surface, these 4 chapters appear to have little in the way of a common thread or a motif to hold them together." So what we're going to see in these 4 chapters are poetry, analytic lists, historical narratives, all of which help to provide us with kind of a well-rounded portrait of David. So these chapters form something of an epilogue. They describe events that occurred sometime during David's reign, but we're not certain when. Scholars seem to think that they happened during the middle of David's reign. Now, there was a question that came up last week about how old David was when Absalom's rebellion took place, and I checked that out, and it was about 60 years old. That's what's the consensus of scholars seems to be. So let's go to chapter 21, famine as a result of the Gibeonite massacre. There's no indication here just when this occurred during David's reign. When did this famine occur? Some have suggested that it was probably after Mephibosheth had come under David's protection in Jerusalem, which would have placed it before Absalom's rebellion. Now, because Palestine was almost totally dependent on rainfall and dew for crop moisture, it was not uncommon to have poor harvests, and they were not automatically considered a sign of God's displeasure. However, when the crops had failed for 3 consecutive years, David concluded, and whoever has Leviticus 26:20, please be ready. David concluded that Israel had somehow offended God, and they were experiencing a judgment as predicted in the Torah, Leviticus 26:20.
Your strength will be spent in vain, because your soil will not yield its crops, nor will the trees of the land yield their fruit.
Okay. And there are other verses that kind of deal with the same thing, but you get the idea. And so David prays to God about the famine, and Yahweh tells him that the famine was due to Saul's slaughter of the Gibeonites. Remember that? David then summons the Gibeonites to ask them what he can do to make things right. Now, at first, they're hesitant to make any requests, much less demands of the king. Keep in mind that, remember the Gibeonite deception back in the book of Joshua? They came from a far country, and they made a pact with Joshua to keep from being exterminated. And so they were members of a servile, alien subculture in Israel. And, back in the book of Joshua, they were allowed to live, but they were kept as virtual slaves and water bearers for Israel. And finally, after some debate here, they asked for 7 of Saul's descendants to be killed and their bodies exposed before God in Saul's hometown of Gibeah. David agrees to this request, but he spared Mephibosheth because of his promise to Jonathan. Now, it's likely that the request for 7 deaths had some kind of symbolic value that we have no idea what it is. Please don't ask me, because I don't know what the symbolic value would be. But you'll recall that the Torah called for retribution in kind, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, for the unsanctioned taking of a human life. And so compensation was not to take the form of money or land. but in a manner prescribed by the Torah. And since it was David who decreed that 7 of the house of Saul must die, it was up to him to choose which 7. That's a really hard choice, isn't it? I think it would be very disturbing to have that task. But the names of the victims are listed along with the names of their mothers. Now, it's interesting that a man named Mephibosheth is listed among the victims. Now, obviously, this was not the same Mephibosheth as the one by the same name who was Jonathan's son. This Mephibosheth is said to have been the son of Saul's concubine, Rizpah, which would have made him Jonathan's half-brother. So it's possible that he had been, the Mephibosheth that we know and love, who was crippled, was named after this man. I don't know. I'm just conjecturing. But the 5 sons of Merab, Saul's daughter, were also handed over for execution, which I think probably would not have made her very happy. Do you think? Losing 5 children. Here we learn that Merab was married to a son of Barzillai. Remember him last week? He appears to be the same man who supported David during Absalom's rebellion. And so if he is the same man, that makes his loyalty to David quite remarkable, I think. I mean, to be loyal to David after killing 5 of your grandchildren, that would irritate me a little bit, at least. Don't you think? If you have grandchildren, you know how much you love them. Anyway, Rizpah, who was the mother of 2 of the victims, mourns her sons, and she stays with the bodies, defending them from the vultures, carrion birds, and animals. And to me, this is kind of the supreme example of maternal love in the Bible, don't you think? Death may have taken 2 of her sons from her, but she made certain that it would not rob them of their dignity. And I think a body loses a little dignity when you're up there, you're being pecked, the eyes are being pecked out by animals and birds, whatever. So, question here, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but does God really manipulate the weather to punish sin? Whoever has Amos 4, please be ready. Can a natural disaster be due to the sinful actions of human beings? In the ancient world, it was believed that natural disasters were due to divine displeasure. And this chapter is not the only one in the Bible that suggests that a natural disaster is tied to God's judgment. For example, Amos chapter 4, verses 6 through 9, explicitly states that God used famine to chastise his people. Okay, whoever has that, go ahead and read that.
I sent you hunger, says the Lord, but it did no good. You still would not return to me. I ruined your crops by holding back the rain 3 months before the harvest. I sent rain on one city, but not another, while 3 cities would make their weary journey for a drink of water to a city that had rain, but there wasn't ever enough. Yet you would return to me, says the Lord. I sent blight and mildew on your farms and your vineyards. The locusts ate your figs and the olive trees, and still you wouldn't return to me, says the Lord.
Okay, wherever you live, if you're not getting any rain, and everybody around you, your next door neighbor and the people across the street are getting rain, you might have done something to irritate the Lord. Just to let you know. Okay. Now it's clear that God can and has used natural disasters as a way of calling people to repentance and chastising them for their sins. So, a little application here. What do we do today when there's a famine or a tornado destroys a town or a forest fire causes the evacuation of a town? I was just reading about something like that out west. I think it was in New Mexico. or farmers when they lose their crops. It's unfortunate, I think, that some well-meaning Christians have attempted to interpret modern natural disasters as evidence of God's judgment. Or he's attributed them to the sins of the disaster victims. One recent example, well, not really too recent now, but you might recall Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans in 2005. Some Christians actually suggested that the reason for the disaster was that New Orleans was a hub for jazz music, which some view as evil. Now, I confess, I like some jazz, okay? Miles Davis, I hope that you don't not come back to the class because of my evil musical tastes, but I like the Beatles too. Anyway, they also believed that New Orleans was immoral because it was the home of the notorious Mardi Gras festival, which I've never been to. Have any of you ever been to the Mardi Gras? No. They view that as evil. Now, one problem with this view is that the New Orleans French Quarter, the supposed center of all of this evil, was one of the least affected areas in the entire city due to the fact that it was on higher ground. In fact, the hardest hit parts of the city were the poorest sections. And so if Katrina was a judgment for the sins of New Orleans, may I just say tongue-in-cheek, God apparently goofed up and missed the correct target.
Yeah.
He drowned the poor people instead. All right. Given the fact that we Christians are often woefully ignorant about such matters, I think it's impossible for us to make judgments about whether natural disasters are a result of a specific human sin, either individual or communal. And you might remember back when AIDS came out, many evangelical Christians were calling it a judgment against homosexuality. I think these matters are probably best left to God. All right?
Well, I was going to say, which a lot of people thought that at the beginning, but it's still primarily a homosexual disease and an intravenous drug user.
Yeah, but I'm going to leave the pronouncements of judgment to God.
I know.
And Bob, a lot of evangelists on television have said that Katrina was a judgment against the United States for their treatment of Israel. Some policy, I forget who was president at the time.
George.
That's a stretch.
Yeah, said that Israel needed to sell some of their land or something like that, and so they project that in their little thinking.
Well, you can make all kinds of connections, I think you're limited only by your imagination when it comes to pronouncing judgments on people. Let's move on to notes on wars against the Philistine giants. Oh, heck. Sweetie, would you bring that weight in for me, please?
Okay.
That I left?
Where is it? In the
In the
trunk?
car on the floor. I've got a visual for you. Okay, this chapter concludes with a note about how, in addition to Goliath, whom David had killed, remember David and Goliath, 1 Samuel 17? We're told that David's soldiers killed 4 other gigantic men from Gath. Now, we're not told how tall these men were, but they're said to descend from Rapha, which is a variant form of Hebrew commonly translated giants. Okay? Now, it's interesting because there are tribes in Africa that are known for their tall people. They have people.
Tutsis,
I'm not sure what they are, but who are some of the tall guys? Manute Bol, I think,
Yeah.
was from this tribe. How tall was Manute Bol? Was he about 7'8"?
Something, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think he even needed to jump to dunk. But you know, there are a lot of people from these tribes that are just abnormally large, and so apparently there was a Philistine tribe that was really large. Anyway, they're said to descend from Rapha, which is a variant of the Hebrew word commonly translated giants. And their great size is confirmed by the weight of their weapons. Now, we're told in verse 16 that the spearhead of Ishi Benob weighed 300 shekels, which is about 7.5 pounds. Ishi Benob. I mean, don't you wish they just named them Bob or Jack or Steve? You know, Mephibosheth. Anyway, the spearhead's 300 shekels, which is about 7.5 pounds. Now Tess is going to the car to get a weight that I wanted to bring in that is 10 pounds. It was the closest thing that I had to 7.5 pounds. And so I'm going to pass this around because can you imagine? And so this would be just a little bit lighter. But can you imagine having a spearhead just a little bit lighter than this? So, you know, can you imagine how big you'd have to be, how strong you'd have to be able to throw that? Anyway, that's the only audio visual that I brought this whole class.
You got another someday back in Illinois? It's beautiful.
One of the gigantic men, just pass it around, please, had an abnormality of having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot.
As an overachiever.
Yeah. I assume that would include the thumb. They included the fingers as thumbs because, you know, we always say, well, I have 4 fingers and 1 thumb, so be accurate. But anyway, the size and strength of these men must have been quite memorable, which would explain why this historical note was included in the first place. Okay? Now, one note about verse 19. It says here that Goliath the Gittite was killed by Elhanan. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time dealing with this, but scholars have treated this in 2 different ways. One is that it's a true contradiction in the text, which I don't believe, which was introduced by a careless copyist. Now, you know that the Hebrew manuscripts were copied over and over again by Jewish scribes. And so, you know, what they're saying is that, you know, one of them was just maybe daydreaming or something, and he copied it wrong. Or maybe he was getting old, yeah.
Didn't they say the monks were that way? Monks copied and they would sometimes fall asleep?
Yeah, that is true. And or he might have been watching television and trying to do the copying at the same time. And this is not something that you want to multitask with. But anyway, another way of looking at it is that it's only a seeming contradiction that can be explained other ways. And the traditional Jewish way of explaining this verse is that Elhanan was actually David's original name, and that David was his regnal name. In any event, we're not going to explain this problem to everyone's satisfaction. But another way of looking at the problem is that the name Goliath was not the name of a man at all, but a type of man. Okay? Are you with me?
Yeah.
And so a Goliath was a man for anybody who was of gigantic proportions. Now, we do the same thing like that today, don't we? Now, when we say that someone is an Einstein, we don't mean that he is actually Albert Einstein,
Right,
who died in 1955,
right,
right?
smart.
What we really mean is that he is a really smart person. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave that. Leave you with that thought. David's song of thanksgiving. And we're going to do this in 2 minutes. David's song is the longest quotation in the Bible attributed to David. It's a classic example of Hebrew poetry. David praises God for delivering him from his enemies throughout his entire reign. It would have appeared. It would appear that it was composed by David after he had been in Israel for several years at least, and the terminology is very reminiscent of the Psalms. Did you get that when you read it? It sounds a lot like some of the Psalms that he wrote. And so, you know, as you read through it, you're going to find echoes from different Psalms. But and whoever has 2 Samuel 22, please be ready. My thinking is that it's possible that David wrote these words prior to his adultery with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah. Why do I believe this? Okay, read verses 21 to 24, whoever has that.
You believe that because of verse 21.
21 to 24.
The Lord rewarded me for doing right. He compensated me for my innocence. Whoops. For I have kept the ways of the Lord. I have not turned from God to follow evil. For all his laws are constantly before me. I have never abandoned his principles. I am blameless before God. I have kept myself from sin.
Okay. Some have suggested that these verses smack of self-righteousness rather than righteousness, and that David was being hypocritical. You know, if I got up here and said, you know, the Lord has kept me from sin, I have lived a righteous life. Now, you might not be, well, he's laughing back there, but my wife would be just rolling over here.
Yeah, right.
See?
We know that's not true, Bob.
Yeah.
Because you gamble on horseshoes.
I do not gamble on horseshoes.
You do not gamble on horseshoes.
I do not gamble on horseshoes.
I thought in class you said one time you gambled $20 a thing. No?
You never heard that from me.
Maybe I'm starting rumors.
Yeah.
No, I've never gambled on horseshoes.
Okay, I thought you got.
I never even knew that people gambled on horseshoes.
Okay.
No, I don't gamble at all.
Oh, that's good.
The only gambling I do is
Highway 27.
getting on Highway 27 to come to church. Exactly. Anyway, I think the answer is found in verse 1, where it says that the writing of this song is tied to the context of his deliverance from Saul. So these words describe how David dealt with Saul many, many years earlier, before this whole brouhaha with Bathsheba and Uriah. And you like that word brouhaha? I love it.
Yeah, brutal.
What's that?
That's a Polk County word.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that. I thought it was a little bit more sophisticated than that. But anyway, so these words describe how David dealt with Saul. Even Saul told David, he said, "You are more righteous than I." And so the way I look at it is that it was many years later that David fell into sin with Bathsheba. Now, we can also see the truth of this song in David's life. When David was proud, God brought him low and humbled him. Okay? All right. Chapter 23. David's so-called last words. If you have a Bible that has the descriptions in there, it'll probably say something like this: the final words of David, or the last words of David, whatever. But it calls it David's last words. However, keep in mind that these are not the last words of David. Okay? David does make a deathbed speech to Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. But keep in mind, too, that the book of Kings is a different book from a different author. And so these are the final words of David as recorded by this particular author. So there's no contradiction here at all, as I see it. They are explicitly introduced as inspired prophecy. It is expressly called an oracle. It says these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, son of Jesse. Now, if ever we do another look at the genres of Scripture, which I may ask Jason if I can do that sometime, you know that in prophecy, you have to understand prophecy by thinking in terms of oracles. You're not looking at chronological narrative when you're looking at prophecies. For example, Isaiah. There's no chronological sequence to the book of Isaiah. If you're looking for chronology, you're going to be very, very confused. But there are three types of oracles found in prophetic writing. You have the woe, the lawsuit, and the promise. And so I think that this oracle is probably closer to a promise than anything else. Now, David's final words remind us of the royal ideal. And he contrasts it with evil men in verse 6. And so David here is extolling a ruler who is righteous and fears God. That is what a king of Israel should look like. He reminds us in his little speech here of the everlasting covenant that God made with him, what we call the Davidic covenant. All right, let's move on to the Soldiers' Hall of Fame, verses 8 and following. This is a historical appendix that lists some of the powerful men who had served David and includes some remarkable anecdotes about their exploits. It's kind of a military honor roll or Hall of Fame, I guess. Now, in the ancient world, credit was not usually given to common soldiers, were they? Was it? Victories were usually attributed to the king. In fact, almost everything that was done was attributed to the king. Now, let me ask you this. You remember the Temple of Solomon that he built? How many bricks do you think he actually laid?
One.
Probably not that
One.
He probably didn't do doodly squat.
One or fewer.
But since it was done under his direction, they say, Solomon built the temple, okay? So this passage, I think, is really surprisingly democratic, and that the writer is giving a lot of credit to the soldiers. Apparently, 3 of David's elite soldiers were in a league of their own. The writer gives their names here and tells some amazing stories about their exploits. They were called the 3. And just below the 3 was an elite commando group called the 30. Now, I guess you could probably equate them with a modern SEAL team, perhaps, or Army Rangers, or Green Beret, maybe. But from the 30 were 3 top soldiers who risked their lives to fulfill David's nostalgic wish that he might have a drink from the well of his hometown in Bethlehem. And when they got that water, David then refused to drink it out of respect for the fact that they risked their lives in getting the water. He poured it out to God as an offering, implying that only God is worthy of such a gift. Now, the fact that these men did this, I think, shows great loyalty to David. And, we see in David the kind of military commander that really inspired his soldiers, didn't he? And plus, when you think about it, it really was a foolhardy thing to do, wasn't it? Chief among these top 3 soldiers was Abishai, who we've already seen. He was the brother of Joab. He was kind of a hothead, as all of the sons of Zeruiah were. And what's interesting is that nowhere is Joab listed among the soldiers. I think Joab's name is very conspicuous for its absence. His armor bearer even makes the list, but not Joab. Some have said that he was not included because he was above all of those on the list, but I think the reason that he was excluded, anybody want to take a guess? Well, there was a lot of bad blood between him and David. There were continual conflicts, and remember, Joab continually disobeyed the orders of David, and even killed his son Absalom when he told him not to, explicitly. And then later on, we're going to find out that Joab was a traitor in the book of 1 Kings during Adonijah's rebellion. He turns out to be a traitor to David. So I think that he's missing here. He's conspicuous by his absence. I learned that word conspicuous when I was in 2nd grade. I was doing a report for my 2nd grade teacher about flamingos. And you know what I learned? That because of their pink color, they are conspicuous. And my mom made me learn that word, and she made me learn how to spell it. Conspicuous. And I never forgot that. So I just wanted to show off a little bit here. That I know more than 3-letter words, so, okay. All right, the list ends on a sober note. Uriah the Hittite is listed as one of David's mighty men. The fact that he is listed last is not by accident, but I think is intended to be noticed by the reader. Because everybody knows what happened to Uriah. Even in a list celebrating the exploits and strengths of David's mightiest men, the sin of David is not forgotten. And so, you know, you read a list like that and you would be inspired. Memorial Day, right? You would be inspired by tales of the exploits of someone like Audie Murphy, for example. Remember Audie Murphy was a World War II hero? Or Unbroken. I've been writing about Unbroken, the story of Louis Zamperini.
Yeah.
You remember? Did anybody see that movie or read the book? That's going to be in my book. Anyway, I was up this morning about 4 o'clock writing about him. And I'm just, you know, it's just an amazing story, what he did. And so anybody reading this list is going to probably be inspired, you know, by patriotic idealism and nostalgia. And then all of a sudden, this mention of Uriah, and all of a sudden, all of those idealistic feelings are kind of muted, aren't they? It's a reminder, I think, that we not put our leaders on a pedestal. The greatest Christian leaders are but servants of God. And any success that they experience is due to God alone. And so we always need to remember who deserves the credit for any accomplishments. It's God. And never put a leader on a pedestal. Now, I'll just make a confession here. I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill. I think he was just an amazing individual. But the reality is, Churchill was a rude, cantankerous human being. Amen? Anybody disagree with me? But yet he's one of my heroes. You know, I believe that he held Britain together during the dark days of World War II. But, okay, last story. David conducts a census.
I got a question for you. This one encounter, he killed 800 men, Joshua,
Yeah?
in one encounter, 800 men, that's a lot of men. I mean,
Tell me about
well,
it.
that's somebody get him first, I'm just saying, you know.
Well, if he had a Gatling gun, that might have made
Well, they didn't.
a lot of
do that,
sense.
but It's fear.
Well, I don't know what to say. You know, it's a lot of men. It is a lot of men. And remember what we said the first day of class? That some of the numbers may not jive because this, again, and I'd have to look at a Hebrew text with the variants, but the manuscripts that we have of 1st and 2nd Samuel are the worst that we have in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
They were apparently eaten by worms. And so whether that is accurate or not, I don't know. But you know, you might have a question about some of the numbers. I don't know. Okay, David conducts a census. The final story in the books of Samuel begins with the anger of the Lord burning against Israel again. Seems like he's always angry with Israel for something. It's separated from the larger story of David, and it's unclear how to place this chronologically. When did this happen? I have no idea. But some scholars believe that the most likely backdrop to the story is the account of the famine and the Gibeonites. But again, this is just conjecture. We just can't be sure how it fits into the story of David. We're guessing. In both cases, Israel has sinned, leading to God's displeasure. But David intervenes to stop the punishment. And so following David's song crediting God with all of his successes and the list of David's mighty men, the book of Samuel closes with the story about David initiating a census to see how many able-bodied men he could use in a war. Now, this is similar to the famine which resulted from Saul's sins. David's sin here results in another national calamity. Unlike Saul, however, David repents immediately of his sin, and when God sends a prophet to David, he obeys him. Now, this is a very puzzling story on many different levels, I think. And it leads us to a lot of different questions. Why is God angry with Israel? What is sinful about a census? I mean, after all, we do a census every, 10 years, is it? In the United States. Denny?
I think it had to do with the spirit of the king being enlivened by a census to go adventuring beyond the boundaries. Oh, I've got 30,000 soldiers. I only thought I had 15,000. Now I can go out and take this city that's been a thorn in my side.
Okay. Another question can be, and whoever has Exodus 30, please be ready, but another question that this leads to is, why does God incite David to take a census?
Well, David knew he was not supposed to.
Yeah, if indeed it's sinful, okay? Now, the short answer to this is, and I think you get a lot of this with me, don't you? I'm not sure I can answer these questions to everybody's satisfaction. But I can make a few suggestions. First of all, why is God angry at Israel? Well, keep in mind that we who are modern readers need to realize that we need to be content with incomplete or non-existent answers. We're simply not told why God is angry at Israel. What we do know is that there is a link in the Old Testament between census taking and plagues. Exodus 30, verse 12. Who has that?
When you take the census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them.
Okay. And I think we might want to also look at the perspective of Joab and Denny. Because I think that Joab saw in the census a shift from David's object of faith, from reliance in God to reliance on military might. And that's pride. Now this leads to the second question. What is sinful about the census? I think it was sinful because David is acting like a typical ancient Near Eastern king instead of an Israelite king. Why were censuses taken? They were taken for military purposes. We take censuses, to assign delegates to Congress. But they were taken in the ancient days for military purposes.
So they were counting only the men.
Yes. Yeah, women didn't count.
Yeah.
Did all of these people live in just the area of Judah and Israel? I mean,
Yes.
you've got
Yes.
800,000 men and
Yes.
500,000 men.
That would be throughout all of Israel. Yes.
But that's not that big of a country. How'd you get all those people in there?
High rises.
With all the wives and all the kids? Get them in there.
Well, New York is not that big of a country, but you got, millions there. How do you fit all those people in New York?
Well, it'd be bigger, but Israel's
Well, keep in mind what Israelite theology says. The Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. 1 Samuel 17:47. And so therefore, I think, in a very real sense, the taking of a census was a lack of faith in God on David's part. Now, final question. Why would God incite David to take a census if it is indeed sinful? Well, apparently God was already angry at Israel for something or other when he incited David. And again, this is, we really can't answer the question. And I know what you're saying. Why are you up here teaching if you don't know anything? I don't know. But we don't know the answer to the question. It can be something of a stumbling block to the modern reader. However, keep in mind that this is not a unique case in the Old Testament. It's similar to the one in 1 Kings. You might recall when God sets out to punish Ahab for his sin or sins by having the prophets deceive him in order to trick him into going into battle so that he could be killed. Basically, God has the prophet lie to Ahab. Now, that's another ethical question that we're not even going to get into today. Another story that's very similar to this, which would be very familiar to you, I think, the story of Balaam in Numbers chapters 22 to 24. Balaam was not an Israelite. He was a pagan seer who, if you recall, he was solicited by the Moabites to curse Israel. Remember? And so Balaam initially refused the Moabites' offer because God told him not to go. Okay? However, the Moabites returned and they upped the ante, so to speak. They offered him substantially more money. And he said, well, okay, I'll go if God tells me to go. And he wound up going, as we know. But remember when he was going, God sent an angel to stop him. And remember, the donkey actually Said, "No way, Jose." He said it in Hebrew. But in the end, Balaam finally winds up going with them, and God is angry with him for going. Gee, go figure, huh? Now, that's a long story, and you can read about it in Numbers, but some scholars see the key for understanding this account in the story of Balaam. So if you want to understand this, don't ask me. I don't know anything. But read the story of Balaam and his ass, and maybe you'll find the key. All right. Despite Joab's objections, and here's one of the few times when Joab was right, David proceeds to go on with the census. It takes over 9 months to complete. Keep in mind that they could not do anything electronically. They had to go throughout the whole country, even though it was not that big a country. It still took a long time to do.
We can't do it in 9 months.
Yeah, we can't even do it now.
9 months.
We can't even count votes.
Yeah, that's true too.
Anyway, after the final numbers are listed for David, he finally has an attack of conscience. David confesses his sin, but the prophet Gad, who, by the way, was probably one of the 3 authors of this book, along with Samuel, was sent by God to see him. He gives David a choice of 3 punishments. Door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. And David chooses door number 3. 3 days of plague instead of 5 years of famine or months of war. And so David places himself into the hands of a merciful God. And as we see, God is merciful. He halts the plague, but not before 70,000 Israelites were killed. And I would imagine they have to go and redo the census after that. Not. Anyway, the chapter ends with David building an altar and praying to God. And with this, the books of Samuel come to a close. And we've been doing this for how long? It's been a long time, hasn't it? It seems like forever, doesn't it? Remember how the story begins? A barren woman praying to God for a child and worshiping God. And it ends with a king praying to God and worshiping. And so those 2 acts of humble adoration, I think, act as bookends for this book. So that's all I got to say. Any questions?
Well,
Yes, sir.
Could you help me with the chronology with the men that went and got the water from Bethlehem? Was that when David was on the run from Saul?
I thought they were from
No, this would have been after
Philistines.
that.
These are Philistines. They went into the Philistine camp.
Oh, okay.
It's been
Yeah.
20 years later, so.
Yeah.
When David was still king.
So, trying to,
There are books, by the way. If you have questions about chronology, I got a question last week about the age of David. I went back and I've got a book. It's called The Chronology of the Old Testament, and so that was a little bit of help to me. And there's also another one by Horner, who was a professor at Dallas, Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ, because there are a lot of questions about when was Jesus born, for example. Well, I'll give you a hint. It wasn't 0 AD. Okay. More like 6 BC. But okay, any other questions that I can't answer? As you have noticed, my areas of ignorance are vast, aren't they?
well, see, Bob, but that's where it's valuable. For most of us, we don't know what we don't know. The more you learn, the more you know what you don't know.
I used to tell my students that getting an education is discovering the vast boundaries of our ignorance. And a lot of people don't like the word ignorant, but I think we're all ignorant of something. You know, there are vast areas of ignorance in our lives. You know, for example, I don't know that there's anybody here that can do brain surgery. So what does that mean? That we're ignorant of that subject, aren't we?
I have a simple question. I was asking him, where did they bury all these people? 70,000 were killed at one time. Where did they put them?
Funerals and.
The land's not that big. There's already a million people living there.
Dottie, how am I supposed to know?
That's a woman's
Like a big
mind.
ditch.
We wanna
Just
know.
asking a simple
on top.
question. Where did you
The
bury
current
them?
population of Israel is 9.5 million.
Well, Dottie, I have no idea what they did with
He
them.
said they just left them on the battlefield.
It just-
I guess they did.
I haven't a clue. Honestly, I don't have a clue. Any other questions or comments? This is,
I do, but
Yes.
this is kinda like Dottie's question. Somewhere during our study, and I've been in children's church, so I've missed some time in here, but David took the head of Goliath to Jerusalem.
right.
It had to be grody, or was it voodoo shrunk, or what?
We'd actually dealt with that
Did you? But I
back,
missed
and I can't remember exactly what we said, but we did say that I think that some people will do anything to get ahead in life.
That's what it is. You gotta have-
That sounds like an answer.
I know you all knew where this was headed. Yeah, I'm sure.
Don't get ahead of yourself, Bob.
Yeah, I'm sure that it did not smell too good. And Judy, did you have a?
I was just gonna suggest it was a mass grave.
Okay.
Yeah, it is that big old.
This has been a long study. I hope that you picked up something, and what I would suggest you do, and again, this is my suggestion to you, read the Bible through every year. Start, do it somehow. There are many different plans that you can use. I use the simplest one, and that is I just simply begin in Genesis, and I read through to Revelation. I'm in the book of Nehemiah now, and I'm right about on track. So, but the more you read the Bible, the more you're going to become familiar with it. And I would suggest a couple books that I'm going to suggest in my book that'll be coming out next year. How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Doug Stewart and Gordon Fee. And also, what's the book by Henrietta Mears? What the Bible is All
Yeah.
About. Excellent. It's probably the best one-volume summary of the Bible that you can get. Anybody know who Henrietta Mears was? She had a tremendous impact on the life of Bill Bright, for example, Dick Halverson, whom I knew, many, many others. Even Billy Graham, I think, didn't she? Didn't she influence Billy Graham? But Henrietta Mears did all of this through a Sunday school class at the Bel Air Presbyterian Church in California. So, read along with it. The Bible can be difficult sometimes. And you have questions, I see them. But get a one-volume commentary or something, and get some of the helps that are available. So anyway, thank you so much for being an attentive audience this year.
One last thing I want to say about,
It's been a long time.
thank you very much. Your insight on all this is extremely valuable, and I really appreciate when you do come up on some of these tough things where it seems like there's a contradiction in the Bible. You give several different viewpoints, and obviously your own opinion as well, which is highly valued. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. How long have we been doing this anyway?